In today's episode, partners are tired of the war. The West is no longer supporting Ukraine. No strikes on civilian infrastructure. Russia is bombing Ukrainian military targets exclusively. Propaganda speculations about socially vulnerable groups. Ukrainian soldiers set up torture chambers for children. Our analytical team at Detector Media is on constant watch, tracking the spread of the boldest fakes from Kremlin propaganda. I'm Vadym Miskyi, and for the next 10 minutes I'll guide you through the key facts. Let's get started. The West is no longer supporting Ukraine. This manipulative claim was circulated by the Russian media. They believe that everyone is tired of the war in Ukraine. The authors cite a statement by British Foreign Secretary James Cleverly as evidence. He supposedly hinted that Ukraine will lose its support in the future. According to propagandists, the British official made this statement during a meeting of the UN Security Council. However, at the meeting, it was the Russian representative alone whose remarks shocked the audience.
Thank you, Mr. President. Insofar as today, in this hall, in addition to you, there are many other senior accomplices of the Kiev terrorist regime present who bear full responsibility for its crimes. I wish to first and foremost touch upon where your actions have led us to today in the context of the Ukrainian crisis. Before our very eyes, the tragedy is being worsened, the root cause of which was what was provoked by the United States and their Western allies. In the best colonial traditions, the anti-constitutional coup in Kiev in 2014. People who, since then, led the Kiev regime were guided certainly not by interests of Ukraine. Contrary to the aspirations of the majority of the Ukrainian people and for the advancement of Western fixations on confrontation with our country, they abandoned peace and good neighborly relations with Russia, a non-discriminatory approach with all nationalities residing in Ukraine, and began by leaps and bounds to advance rabid nationalism and to whitewash Nazi war criminals.
The British representative, meanwhile, listed war crimes committed by the Kremlin.
We cannot allow this war to go on for another 500 days. The UN General Assembly has called repeatedly for peace, a peace that is based on the principles of the UN Charter and our shared belief that might does not equal right. President Zelensky's 10-point plan has shown a way forward. Ukraine wants peace. We want peace. The whole world wants peace. Peace will bring home Ukraine's lost children and feed the hungry of the world. Peace will keep the promises we all made in the UN Charter. And peace will pave the way to a reformed multilateral system. And peace will help deliver the Sustainable Development Goals. A just and lasting peace is what we all want. The Russian Federation can choose peace today by withdrawing all Russian forces from Ukraine. Mr. Putin, bring your troops home. End this war now.
Russian propagandists distorted the context of the statement by the British representative to the UN. James Cleverly also stressed that the Russians will be held accountable for crimes committed on Ukrainian territory. There are no signs that the UK is going to stop helping Ukraine. Russia only strikes Ukrainian military targets and never attacks civilian infrastructure. This is what we are hearing from all Russian sources. They claim that the Kremlin has nothing to do with the destruction of apartment buildings, shopping malls, churches and grain terminals.
Про Одессу, если можно, буквально пару слов. Мы, разумеется, не агрессоры, но с удовольствием смотрим на то, как мы уже третью ночь подряд наносим удары, как нам было сказано, удары возмездия. Так же Песков сформулировал.
We woke up here to heartbreaking images of a severely damaged historic cathedral, the largest Orthodox church in Odessa. A Russian missile hit the Transfiguration Cathedral and other historical buildings that lie in the historic heritage center of Odessa. At the same time, it was heartening to see that hours later, parishioners and volunteers donning hard hats, shovels, and brooms began removing rubble and tried to salvage any artifacts. The cathedral in Odessa is not the only religious site damaged throughout the war. According to a preliminary assessment undertaken by UNESCO, 116 religious sites have been damaged since 24th of February 2022. The United Nations condemned the attack.
This is just one of the many examples of propagandists' lies. The reaction of Western partners was forceful. Russia is deliberately destroying grain and infrastructure, which could bring certain countries to the brink of famine, said the US Secretary of State.
A few weeks ago, Russia tore up that agreement. The result has been rising prices for countries around the world. The result has been a diminution in the access to these food products, particularly for developing countries. And as we've seen, Russia's actions since then, not only in tearing up the deal, but in intentionally targeting food silos in Ukraine, literally destroying food, as well as the means to produce it, while holding ports and sea lanes at risk to prevent countries from shipping these products out of Ukraine and to the people who need it. I think we've heard from around the world a chorus of condemnation for this action and the strong desire on the part of many, many countries that this arrangement be put back in place. And it's very simple. It's on Russia to decide whether to do so. Of course, it could end the war that it started tomorrow, and that would solve the problem definitively. But short of that, at the very least, the world is insisting that it restore the Black Sea Grain Initiative.
While the Russian authorities have admitted to winter attacks on the Ukrainian energy system, they continue to deny or even blame Ukraine for the missile attacks with large numbers of victims. The West has never supported Moscow's position regarding attacks on civilians. Therefore, the target audience for these statements remains limited to the Russians. Ukraine killed a Russian journalist with cluster munitions supplied by the United States. This manipulative claim was spread by Kremlin propagandists.
Киевский режим начал активно применять на поле боя поставленные США кассетные боеприпасы. 22 июля этим видом вооружения обстрелян гражданский автомобиль с журналистами. Погиб военкор РИА Новости Ростислав Журавлев.
In fact, the information that the propagandist was killed by cluster munitions appears only on channels that spread pro-Russian narratives. No credible evidence has been presented. The International Federation of Journalists and UNESCO expressed concern over his death and called for an investigation into its circumstances. They called the propagandist Zhuravlev a journalist and thus repeated the Russian propaganda message. Let's take a look who Rostislav Zhuravlev really was. He personally took part in hostilities against Ukraine, which has been proven by numerous photos with weapons as well as his photos on social media. Here is a Russian newspaper from 2014. The title of the article is "Journalist from the Urals is fighting in the Donbass." Zhuravlev took part in the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the seizure of the Donetsk Regional State Administration. Here is his biography from the Russian federal agency RIA Novosti. Quoting the propaganda media, from July to December 2014 he was in the military conflict zone in Luhansk on the territory of the People's Militia. He volunteered for the Inter-Brigade as a member of the Zarya battalion of the so-called Lugansk People Republic. This photo shows Zhuravlev carrying arms, military equipment and symbols of the illegal armed group LPR, which is not recognized in the civilized world. In 2022, Zhuravlev came to Ukraine again, supposedly as a reporter. The letter Z on Zhuravlev's clothes is a symbol of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I think no further comments are necessary. Ukraine's Western partners explain that there would have been no casualties among Russian journalists if Russia had not unleashed a bloody war.
The United States condemns any attacks on journalists wherever and whenever they take place. But I have to say that in this circumstance, the solution is for Russia to end its war of aggression against Ukraine. A lot of the tragedies that we see playing out across Ukraine, including the one I mentioned with children who've been abducted from their families, with civilians who've been tortured in interrogation centers, with journalists, now dozens of journalists who've been killed in this war. None of this would have happened if Russia had not invaded its neighbor with absolutely no reason whatsoever other than a desire for imperial control of additional land. So Russia could really rectify this situation by putting an end to this war of choice today, if it chose to do so.
The propagandists are targeting a Western audience with such messages. They claim that Ukraine is killing journalists and freedom of speech with Western weapons. I would like to remind you that since the beginning of the full-scale war, 65 journalists have been killed in Ukraine while revealing the truth about Russian aggression. Kremlin propagandists regularly use the problems of socially vulnerable groups to promote the desired narratives. For instance, disinformation related to children is frequently a major topic in the Russian media. Among the most recent fakes is the claim that Ukrainian soldiers are supposedly setting up torture chambers for children. The case was investigated by the Center for Strategic Communications of Ukraine. There is no evidence that Ukrainian soldiers torture children. Yet it is the Russians who are illegally moving Ukrainian children from the occupied territories to Russia, which is a war crime.
I'm going to focus on those who have been forcibly deported in this war and those who are going hungry as a result of it. In Kyiv last month, I met a teenage boy. I will call him Dennis. When the Russians captured his hometown, they told Dennis and his classmates that they were going to go on a holiday. They were, in fact, transported to a Russian camp where they were neglected, indoctrinated, and abused. Dennis's distraught mother was desperately searching for him, but the Russians, pretending to look after Dennis and countless others, told him his parents had abandoned him. The boy's ordeal lasted for 7 months before his mother, thanks to the charity Save Ukraine, found him and brought him home. But 19,000 Ukrainian children remain in Russian camps, and their parents are desperately searching for them.
The International Criminal Court in The Hague has put Putin and the Russian Commissioner for Children's Rights, Lvova Belova, on the wanted list for kidnapping. According to Human Rights Watch, at least several thousand Ukrainian children have been taken to the occupied territories or to Russia since the beginning of the full-scale war. Around 100 Ukrainian orphanages that housed more than 32,000 children ended up under Russian occupation. Stay tuned so that you will never fall for Kremlin propaganda. Ukraine will win. We are thankful to our Western partners.